Good evening. It's not always the loudest noise that gets your attention. A very quiet acknowledgement can get your attention. My name is A.J. Berg. I'm a member of the Clay County African American Legacy and currently serving as its president. And I just want to take this opportunity to welcome you, the Clay County African American, Clay County
up their lands along the Missouri River and moved to reservations in central Kansas. In addition, the Wyandot tribe, whose original lands extended along Lake Ontario, steadily moved west until they were forcibly moved by the promise of 148,000 acres of free land west of the Mississippi River. That promise was an empty one. The Delaware tribe eventually gave them some land at the mouth of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, and they platted Wyandot County, which later became Kansas City, Kansas. Tonight, we acknowledge with respect that we are on the traditional and ancestral land of the Missouri Nation before their forced removal by the United States government in the early 1800s to land in Oklahoma. We express gratitude to the many tribes and specifically the Missouri Oto elders and people for their care and respect of their homeland for many generations. Now, I have several housekeeping matters before we get into the presentations. There is a lot of information on your table. Some of it is from Corbin Theater, so you can see what they're doing. And as you may know, their performances take place in this room now. There are black cards that are information cards about Clay Countians for inclusion, including a QR code on one side there. There are information sheets to provide feedback to us at the end of the evening or throughout the evening if you like. On the back of your program, there's space to take notes during the evening. There are cards, 3x5 cards that are blank. If you have questions during the first presentation, you can jot those questions down. Somebody will hopefully come by and pick those up, and we will address the ones we can, given the time limits that we have. There is water in the back of the room, if you'd like that to accompany your Halloween candy this evening. And we're looking forward to a wonderful, wonderful evening. Our first presentation will be from Liberty Public Schools and their Equity Journey. Presenting tonight will be Dr. Jeremy Tucker and Dr. Andrea Dixon-Seahorn. Dr. Tucker has served as superintendent of Liberty Schools since 2014. He earned his bachelor's degree from Evangel University, his master's at Southwest Baptist University, and his doctorate from St. Louis University. Dr. Andrea Dixon-Seahorn is Chief Equity Officer for the Liberty Schools. She earned her bachelor's degree at UMKC, her master's at the University of Missouri-Columbia, and her doctorate from William Woods University. And let's welcome Dr. Tucker and Dr. Dixon-Seahorn.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be with you all this evening. I'm going to follow suit and unmask from a distance, if that's okay. So thanks for joining us in person, but then also for everyone that is online, viewing this in real time or later on at your leisure. As I was thinking about this evening, I think it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago that I first met Dr. Salih and his wife, where they hosted a gathering at their home when he was at William Jewell College. And it was really for the purpose of meeting the new guy in Liberty, but then also really emphasizing the importance of partnership, but more importantly, community. And so I appreciate the invitation to be here this evening and share a little bit about the work that we've been involved in over the last several years. And I always love the opportunity to come to the Garrison School. As a former history teacher, I know one afternoon I called up Mr. Bird and I said, hey, is there a way I could sneak into the Garrison School? Because we were getting ready for a leadership training and I didn't know much about the Garrison School at the time. And I said, I want to do a scavenger hunt and I want to do it in the Garrison School. And I want our team, our leaders, to learn a little bit about our history. It was fascinating to bring people in. Students in Liberty Public Schools. So we want to walk you through this evening just really a brief journey. There's a whole lot more we could spend time talking about, but really focusing on our equity journey and the work that we're currently involved in with our strategic plan and a couple of other pieces. So to dive right in, you do have some information that we added at your tables. I may need some help. This was working a while ago. There we go. You do have some information at your tables. Included is what you see here, this little front and back page document that just has some district information that you may or may not be aware of. I will say this is a little dated. We're in the process of finalizing a draft that will go to our printers tomorrow. But we stand close to about 13,000 students, pre-K through grades 12. People often ask us about that data, but then they also ask us, what does that demographic makeup look like? And so we sit at about 20% free and reduced lunch. We also have approximately 22 to 23% minority as compared to Caucasian population, about 77% Caucasian across 19 different campuses with nearly 2,000 staff or 2,000 employees. That's some of the information that's contained on the front of this piece. On the back of this piece, you have some programmatic information, which is also an important aspect to the work that we do in Liberty Public Schools. And that as you read the different programs that exist in our community, that is an integral part to the work that we do around diversity and equity and inclusion. Because our hope and our effort is really to be able to provide opportunities for pre-K through grade 12 students in and around whatever they're passionate about, whatever they're interested in, coming alongside them and bridging them from that pre-K through 12 experience to whatever else lies beyond Liberty Public Schools. I want you to tuck that away because that's an important piece as we think about how we differentiate learning and provide 13,000 customized, personalized, different opportunities for our students, from those that come from affluent backgrounds or low socioeconomic, a variety of nations represented in our school system, as well as a variety of abilities, from gifted to special needs and all parts in between. That's really what we want to focus on this evening in service to our learners. To take that a step further, wanted to go to the next slide and share kind of our journey. As I entered Liberty Public Schools in our community about 8 years ago, I wanted to try to capture the essence of who we are as a community, and these specific images stood out to me at that time. At that time, we focused on 3 key words, and that was to inspire, invest, and innovate. And I was getting acclimated to Liberty Public Schools and our city, our community, the east and the west side around Clay County and so forth. These images helped shape who we are and what we're about as a community. From that downtown atmosphere that we see off the square, not too far from here. Next to that was an industrial facility that I got to view and tour that, showcased some high-tech technologies and opportunities that are available to us right in our backyard that many people may not know about. That community and partnership aspect that we have for a long time with William Jewell College and that higher education portion that many of our students go on to a 2 or 4 year institution, but then also the opportunities we provide our students through a variety of fine arts activities, athletic opportunities, just a myriad of things that are afforded to our students. That middle portion is students working in the business sector that are experiencing real world learning opportunities that then they can explore and experience beyond high school, and engaging them with business partners, with mentors, with community members across a variety of sectors. And then lastly, that scene of Kansas City that really kind of brings the importance of being part of a region in all that our region has to offer us. As I've shared with these kind of pictures or images with our community in the past, for me, 8 years ago, it really helped me understand that we're kind of a unique, dynamic, complex composition in our community with a tremendous history and a tremendous future. We've since moved from this a little bit in how we're messaging and how we're kind of thinking about the future within Liberty Public Schools, which I wanted to share as well. You can move on to the next slide. So over the course of the last 8 years, I've really floated in and out of two kind of guiding questions. 8 years ago, it was this question: what does it mean to be learner-centered? And I started asking our community these questions and meeting with various stakeholders, whether it was our Board of Education, our staff, our teachers, our district leadership team, which includes our principals and directors. And we started answering this question. And so in your mind, if you'll picture for a quick moment, 3 concentric circles. At the center of that concentric circle is every single learner, surrounded by Liberty Public Schools, and then that last tier being our Liberty community. And so we started answering this question and developed the attributes of a learner. And it ranged from gender to background to grade level to ability, you name it. That's kind of that learner at the center. And then surrounded by the school system as it relates to all the programs and all the supports that we have in place for 13,000 students. And then on the periphery, we started identifying what are those characteristics of our community that serve to support our learners. Through that process, we identified several priorities that we wanted to embark upon in thinking about strategic planning and the work of our district a little differently. It started with relationships. It was, how do you personalize an experience? How do you use data to inform your decision making? But then one of the last pieces is, how can we take and shift our mindset from teachers solely being the focus to the learner being the focus, which then changes the role of the teacher. The teacher is not just the sage on the stage, so to speak, but that teacher shifts to being the guide on the side, that mentor or that coach, as students start to be owners and drivers and agents of their learning. Several years later, our strategic plan was getting ready to sunset. And so we came back to the drawing board with another question. I'm full of questions. And that question is really this: what does it mean to thrive? It actually started with a much longer question. That original question was, how might we co-create an agile strategic plan utilizing an equity-centered design thinking framework so that all learners thrive? That's why we shortened it. But the reason why that particular word, thrive, stood out to me is, as I was thinking about how do you move our community and our district forward toward this learner-centered mindset, which is about every single student, not just aiming for the middle. My hope was, and our collective hope as a Board of Education, I look at several of our staff and leaders here and board members here, our hope was that everyone could connect to this word. Because I think, whether it's my family personally, for my wife and I and our children, whether it's our neighbors that live behind us for their family and their children, or whether it's for the elderly family down the road, whether it's for a church, an organization, Clay Countians, for inclusion, or whatever organization, my hope would be we can all gather in community around this concept that we want every single person in the Liberty community to thrive. If people can't rally around that, something's wrong. So that's why we've leveraged that term and that idea to guide our guidance and direct us as we think about strategic planning. As mentioned, there are a few items within that original question. We wanted it to be agile. We wanted it to be focused on every single student, and not isolate or not alienate any single student. That's why we landed on that piece. There are a couple of companion portions that helped us answer that question as we think about strategic planning. So if you'll flip to the next slide. And these are these two pieces. The portion on the left you have at your tables, and we call that our graduate profile. This is a relatively new piece. And just a quick backstory, we were ready with our Board of Education to present this in March of 2 years ago now, when the pandemic hit and we closed schools for the fourth quarter. That was a little disappointing. So we had planned on bringing this forward at that board meeting. We shifted, and instead we're having conversations about, hey, all schools are going to close. We thought initially for 2 weeks, and it ended up being an entire quarter. And of course, the experience of last year and this school year. The backstory to our graduate profile is, rather than solely thinking about we need to refresh our vision or we need to refresh our mission or our values, We wanted to lead with a graduate profile, and so a brief description. We visited with our community, from our students to our parents to business leaders to employees of our district, teachers, and the like, and we asked questions in and around what are those skills and dispositions that we feel our graduates need in order to be successful in life, whatever they choose to pursue. And this is what surfaced. And so we identified 5 key areas with the help of a consultant. Those areas are academic, cultural, personal, professional, and entrepreneurial. Each of those areas is defined, as you can see on this item. Below the definition are the key skills and dispositions that were identified or that surfaced through everyone in our community's input that participated on what we feel our learners need. Pre-K through grades 12, but ultimately as they walk across the stage to receive a diploma, they're not only equipped with that academic content, but they're equipped with a lot of these skills and dispositions. That was the first piece. Quite honestly, identifying those areas is the easy work. The more difficult work is trying to figure out how that connects to grade levels in different ways from pre-K all the way through 12th grade. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The second piece was identifying our strategic plan areas of focus. And there are 5 areas that we'll speak about in just a moment. But we wanted to be able to tell the story that if we've identified the right work and we have the plans in place to effectuate that work, what might it look be able to work with different sectors and business partners around mentoring and those internship opportunities we talked about, or sending students over to Metropolitan Community College for a dual credit course or early college access. In addition, project-based learning that rounds out the teaching category. From a leadership standpoint, focusing on all of our staff on these key areas: equity audits and needs assessments, cross-cultural communication, ensuring work-life balance for our leaders and our staff and our employees, which I would put an exclamation point behind right now, especially.
So one of the things we aim to articulate as a mission for us here in LPS is that our mission is to create. That means you got to do it on purpose, right? With intentionality, to create a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizational culture. And culture, by the way, is a word that really means this is what we do here. Okay? I'm getting the bobbleheads right there. So you're connecting with me. I love it. And so we set out to, first of all, at a high level view, define diversity, equity, inclusion. Oftentimes when people hear those terms, they kind of cringe and wonder, okay, what do you mean by that? So diversity, very simply, is really speaking to representation. It's about the various dimensions of difference and how they show up here in our organization. So the various cultural identities, lived experiences that not only students and families, but staff bring to the organization. That's what we're talking about when we speak to diversity. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves as we engage in our work is who's represented here in our organization and who isn't? And if there isn't representation, then why not? Okay. Secondly, equity. That's a word that sometimes people hear it and go, okay, wait a minute, what are you talking about there? And so equity, very simplistically speaking, is about access, the full access that all of our learners should have to the resources, to the supports, to the interventions, to whatever it is they need to meet them at their point of need as they are on their personalized pathways of learning so that they can thrive. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, where do we have equitable outcomes and where do we not? How is equity being served? How is it not being served as we make this a part of our everyday work? And then lastly, inclusion. Inclusion, very simply, is about participation. Who's at the table? Who got an invitation in the first place? Who's seated at the table? Who's able to fully participate in the discussion, the conversation, bringing forth concerns as we engage in shared decision-making? It doesn't mean the loudest voice, but all the various perspectives that need to be heard. That's what we have to consider. And so the question there is, who's seated at the table and who isn't? And if they're not at the table by way of representation, why aren't they here? And what do we need to do to be more inclusive in making sure all voices are heard? That's a process. That's a shift. All right. And then the other thing that we set out to do was to establish some aspirations. You heard Dr. Tucker mention thrive, and you heard the word aspire. And aspire just really means, what is it that we want to become? What's the legacy we want to leave to the next generation? And so we said that we want to aspire to enhance learning outcomes for our students, to close equity gaps. We said we want to examine and improve, I call it the 3 Ps, our educational policies, our practices, our processes. And we have some ways that we are endeavoring to do that by way of equity action planning. Every school leader, every director, every department, they're now in their 2nd year of equity action plans where they get to focus in on an area where we know, where we have a hunch, where data tells us there may be some disparities, so we can begin to address that. Next, implementing culturally responsive practices, and not just teaching practices, but even leadership practice. That's an important skill that our business partners told us that they want in students. And so we are working on that. So that's really about cultural competence. It's being empathetic, an active listener. It's being able to be engaged in the moment, being able to have discourse with others. Sometimes we have to agree to disagree, but it's being able to, no matter who you interact with, that you can find some kind of common ground. Because we actually have more in common than different if we take the time to get to know one another. And then being civically and globally aware. And if you go to the last slide that I'm responsible for, that leads us to the work that we are just at this point embedding in what we do every day. And that is about creating a sense of belonging. And so this is now our foundational text. I have it here with me. I keep this book with me. It just goes everywhere I go. And what I love about this text, it is co-authored by Dr. Floyd Cobb and John Crownapple, Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. And every single person in this room is worthy of dignity. You don't have to earn it, okay? Okay, and that's a critical piece for our work moving forward, that every student, every family, every staff member is worthy of dignity by way of just being a human being. And so when we think about what those dispositions are, these are the things we want to cultivate in students, but we know as adults, we gotta first cultivate it in ourselves. It's about empathy, trying on new perspectives. It's about being patient with ourselves and others. This work doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It's an inner work that has an outward manifestation. Openness, just being open to taking risks. And I love what we're about as an innovative school district, failing forward, right? And then listening, seeking first to understand rather than to be understood. And so if anyone argues with these dispositions, about belonging, then you know what, they're gonna have to argue about them with themselves. Because this is what our work is about moving forward, as we have now partnered with the Core Collaborative on this work. We've started already at the board governance level through board study session, professional learnings. We also will be working, the authors will be working with our district leadership team coming up in December. And then second semester will shift and we'll have some on-site coaching and support for our secondary school leadership teams at the site level. And then from there, should we renew our contract with them, then we'll move forward with elementary. So those are the highlights, I believe, what I'm responsible for sharing. Let's go to the next slide just to make sure. That's it. I'm passing on to Dr. Tucker. Thank you.
What Dr. Salee did not share is that both Drs. Dixon-Seahorn and myself have church backgrounds, so we can go all night. But I do want to wrap it up here pretty quickly and then open it up for some questions. I think we have some time for questions. bring it kind of to a close as far as our work, we could go into more depth on all of this and appreciate Dr. Dixon-Seahorn, such a great communicator, but more importantly, an incredible heart on behalf of all of our 13,000 students and again, nearly 2,000 staff. What's represented on this screen are a variety of programs that you might have or may not have heard of over the years, from parents as teachers listed on the top over to the right there that focuses on students that aren't even in our system yet and their families, and coming alongside young parents with newborn kiddos and, what do I need to be doing? Where do my kids need to be? All the way to support of our English language learners, students that come to us with traumatic experiences, and how we circle and rally around them in support of their needs through a variety of interventions, all the way to some of the areas we're focusing in on science and mathematics and robotics, to our fine arts and activities, all the way down to a STEAM bus that focuses on arts integration and creativity. You might have heard of the Northland CAPS program, the College Board for those students that embark upon AP programs and courses. The reason why I show this slide, not every student participates in these activities. We can look at our percentages, we can look at the breakdown, and what we want to try to focus on is allowing access and opportunity for those students that choose to embark on any one of these individual areas. And so my point is twofold. How do we ensure access and opportunity to these programs over time? But then more importantly, how do we pull in new programs for kids that might want to explore an area where we may not have a course, we may not have a pathway for, we may not have a partner in the community that would open up their doors and be a mentor or offer up an internship for that student that wants to pursue a particular opportunity. This is a terrible example, but I'm going to say it anyway. It goes so far as to say, if a student comes to me and says, I want to be a beekeeper, guess what we need to do? We need to go find a beekeeper and connect them to that student and say, here's how we got to do this, right? That example has never received an applause. But I use it to say, that's our work. That's what it means to thrive. In part, there's a lot to that. But if we can tailor experiences to every single student, it's not about sameness. It's about access, it's about opportunity, it's about support, and providing frameworks as safety nets to ensure that every student is successful in whatever they pursue. Think about it like this. That high school student walks across the stage at graduation. They get their diploma, which represents all of the academic content that they've learned over the years. But more importantly, they have an experience, a +1. It might be an internship, it might be an entrepreneurial experience, it might be a credential, it might be a work experience, it might be something they've created on their own that we've not even thought of yet, quite honestly, that then bridges their time from graduation to whatever lies ahead. They're going to sit and stand in front of college admissions counselors. They're going to sit or talk to a prospective employer. They're also going to sit across from Army recruiters for the armed services. And my hope
but we get to be creative as educators with respect to the resources that we pull. So one of the things we do have going on actively right now is the establishment of a curriculum audit task force. Teacher leaders all across the district, various content areas and grade levels. And what we're endeavoring to do is to establish some type of tool that their colleagues can use to, when they are selecting a resource, that it can be vetted more thoroughly so that we can just be sensitive to what is the resource, how is it depicting certain cultures, what do the illustrations look like, are they accurate, things of that sort. So that's what we're working on so that we can be more culturally sensitive in the delivery of our instructional resources and materials. So just wanted to add that to what Dr. Tucker's already mentioned.
Yeah, we have another question, but we are so behind that we will get your answer to this and put it on our website.
Well, our next presentation is a pre-recorded presentation by Dr. Christopher Wilkins. He is professor and chair of the history department at William Jewell College. He's going to present this evening on enslavement in Clay County and the reckoning of what he has learned, what his research team has learned, and will share some of that with us. Dr. Wilkins earned his undergraduate degree at Duke University, his master's and doctor's degrees at Stanford University, and his areas of expertise include the Civil War and Reconstruction. As I noted, his presentation is pre-recorded, so we'll not have any questions at the conclusion of his presentation. So are we ready to roll? Great.
I'd like to begin by thanking Clay Countians for Inclusion for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. I think that the work you are doing is incredibly important and needs to be done, and I am happy to help with that however I can. I also need to begin by apologizing directly to Marty Jacobs. Marty, I know that I told you I would keep my presentation under 25 minutes. I tried and I failed. So if you need to cut me off exactly at 25 minutes, I understand. One of the reasons why I recorded my lecture is so that people can go back and watch it later if they want to, especially if I am speaking too quickly or being unclear. Another thing I want to acknowledge is that I will often be speaking in a robotic voice that one often uses when you're reading text directly off of a computer screen. I am doing that because there's so much information I want to convey, and I want to make sure that I get everything right. So even if the presentation itself in terms of the delivery is not compelling, I hope that the content will at the very least engage your attention. So bear with me. There are three major topics I'm going to focus on. One is the pro-slavery past of Clay County and William Jewell College. The second is how I teach those things to my students. And the third is why I think studying slavery is important. I am an associate professor and chair of the Department of History at Jewell. I've taught at Jewell for the past decade. And before that, I earned my PhD in history at Stanford. I am a historian of slavery and anti-slavery movements. I study how pro-slavery societies are built and maintained, how abolitionist movements try to destroy them, clear away the rubble, and build something better in their place, but how often pro-slavery factions, even after the formal abolition of slavery, continue to fight to maintain the economic and racial order at the heart of the slave system, and often succeed and perpetuate the legacies of slavery for generation after generation. And I study how present-day public history initiatives focused on a community's pro-slavery past can be useful in promoting inclusion in that community if the investigations are carried out and the history is told in a completely honest way. What I'll focus on tonight is an account of work I've done over the past year with an independent group of Jewell students, alumni, and faculty who are dedicated to uncovering slavery's influence on the early history of Jewell. Operating under the title of the Slavery, Memory, and Justice Project, our mission is to tell the full, uncompromising truth about that history and educate others about it because we believe it will promote inclusion in our community. Our work is definitely relevant to the mission of Clay Countians for Inclusion. Regarding how relevant it is to the equity effort of Liberty Public Schools, I need to underline a word I mentioned earlier: independent. None of the work that the Jewell students, alumni, and I have done is connected to or has been carried out in any way in collaboration with Liberty Public Schools, the Jewell administration, or any other group. So if you are a parent alarmed that your children are going to be taught what you hear in tonight's lecture, I do not think that will happen. And maybe that is as it should be. I don't know when students are old enough to learn the reality of slavery, to learn about how brutal it was. It's a heavy history. Adults should be ready. College students are ready. I've seen that. Before that age, I don't know. Many people will not want these things talked about at all, but others may say, good work. Our community needs to know about slavery's profound hold on our history, because when they do, maybe then more people will be willing to take down a statue that honors Confederate soldiers some of whom fought with Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry at the Fort Pillow massacre. I hope the positive reaction is more common, but even if not, my students and I will continue doing the work. When we began our research, we committed to having the intellectual integrity to follow the evidence wherever it might lead, no matter what comfortable narratives we might challenge. And we committed to having the moral integrity to teach others about our work, even in the face of people being angry. I gave my students my word that I would be with them every step of the way, no matter what, and I will. We are already making progress. Our work has been featured in the Kansas City Beacon, KC Star, and KCUR's website, and we will keep moving forward. Next fall, we're going to publish a 100-page report on the history of slavery and Jewell. We're going to create a website with more than 1,000 sources on the history of slavery in Clay County and Missouri. We're going to make a series of documentaries highlighting students' work and providing them a platform to share their views on how our community should engage our history. We should pay attention to students' views and not dismiss them because they come from young people. I have often found that older people have just as many bad ideas as students. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to older people. We should listen to young people as well. These are people who deserve to have their voices heard and not dismissed because they're young or because people are afraid that they're going to be too radical in their views. We're also researching the identity of the hundreds of enslaved people whom Jewell's founders exploited to create the wealth used to found the college. Currently, we have over 150 names. Honoring the individuals whose coerced labor provided the money that enabled the founding of the college, that's the right thing to do. And I'm writing a book on my experience teaching this material. Many people may be sympathetic to the work that I've mentioned. Others may think it is a terrible idea that I'm encouraging students to be honest and think critically about the past, including that of their community and country, to base their views on extensive, well-considered, credible evidence, to be rigorous about their inquiry, and not just believe something because it fits into their preferred historical narrative about their community or America, whether that is positive or negative. And I want them to consider how more accurately understanding the past, if it's told in an honest way, can help build a better future, but only if we have the courage to fully grapple with the past, including the worst parts. I think those are good things for students to learn. What I'll do now is walk you through examples of how my students and I have looked into Jewell's past and tell you about conclusions we've drawn. We began our work in the summer of 2020 in an idealistic fashion. We looked around our country and we saw terrible things happening, many tied to the legacy of slavery. We also observed positive things happening with many communities undertaking a reckoning on racism in their local community, in part by working to understand the influence of slavery on their history. My students and I decided that we wanted to contribute to that cause. We studied the work of more than 50 colleges and universities that since 2003 have studied their slaveholding past. We concluded that the best work had been done by Brown University and UVA. We decided that we would learn from those best practices and then apply them to that work that we're doing at Jewell and contribute to a broader national movement. And we would work, and this is really important, in a grassroots, community-based way, in a democratic fashion where anyone willing to engage in open intellectual inquiry, grounded in historical research, would be welcome to contribute. Everyone, whether a first-year student or professor, would have an equal right to have their voice heard and ideas considered and judged by the quality of their argument and evidence rather than perceived authority. That is a powerful way to begin a project. When students believe that what they're doing really matters, when they believe that they're contributing to a cause larger than themselves, it is amazing how determined they can be to do the work and share what they've learned. Next, we followed with an open-ended question, which is a great way to begin a project in my experience. Instead of trying to arrive at a pre-existing conclusion, we committed to rigorous intellectual inquiry, to gathering as much evidence as we could, not only on pro-slavery sentiment, but to search for things related to ambivalence or opposition as well. And we took the overarching question, how did slavery influence the early history of William Jewell College? and then mapped out a dozen sub-questions, including what influence did slavery have on the financial foundations of the college? I tell my students, if you want to understand a community's values, pay attention to how it organizes its economy. If you hear that and think, I knew it, here is a Marxist, America-hating radical poisoning the minds of young people, you don't need to pick up a copy of Das Kapital to recognize that the choices a community makes on how to organize its economy are a reflection of its values. Rather than rely on Marx, we could turn to the work of another dangerous radical who made the same point. The book of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And it's not a radical idea to note that colleges demonstrate their values and in part define their identity by where they choose to accept money from. Building on that, here is a document we've used to frame the entire project. That's another common theme in our work. Find a particularly illuminating document, get a group of people to read it together, ask a wide array of questions, share interpretations, refine them in conversation, and connect that document to larger issues. Rather than telling students what to think, you are showing them how to think and helping them not only contribute to a project, you're helping them acquire valuable critical thinking and research skills and confidence that their contributions and their voices matter. The document is a page from the Liberty Tribune from February 15th, 1850. It is Dr. William Jewell's announcement inviting bids from contractors to build Jewell Hall. It is a pivotal moment in the college's origin story. It is a testament to the generosity of Clay Countians and Missouri Baptist in that they provided the financial foundation that made this announcement possible. And they deserve our gratitude. They deserve credit for establishing this college that has enabled generations of young people to get a great education and to go on and do great things in the world. People at Jewell are doing great things and will continue to do so. But if you stop there, you're missing an important part, a very significant part of Jewell's origins. And to see those, look at the column over from the announcement. If you look on the bottom right-hand side, you will see a Negro woman and child for sale. The advertisement reads, a Negro woman and child for sale. The woman is about 20 years of age and sound. For particulars, inquire of editor. So you have a 20-year-old woman and a child, very likely her child, who are about to be sold. It's an economic transaction, which raises the question, how much wealth did it bring to the owner? Prices for enslaved women in the 1850s in Missouri often ranged from $500 to $700. Prices for children varied. In an interview from the 1930s, Bill Sims, a formerly enslaved man who lived in Missouri, remembered that when he was young, my oldest sister was sold on the auction block with her children and a baby in her arms sold for $300. In another interview with a formerly enslaved man, he recalled that when he was 4 years old, he was taken away and separated from his entire family, sold on a big stump. I remember my mammy crying and I was scared. They auctioned me off for $450. The woman in the Tribune advertisement had to experience not only enslavement and being sold herself, but having to watch these things happen to her child. And if the child were female, the mother knew that the child would one day be expected to produce new property for her enslaver in the form of children. And the whole cycle would begin again. It was an economic transaction and a human tragedy. And the money from that sale went into the pocket of this white Clay Countian. We don't know who the seller was. We do know that buying and selling human beings was an everyday occurrence in Clay County. Read every issue of the Tribune prior to 1865. You will find hundreds of references of people being bought and sold. Look at all Missouri newspapers from the antebellum era. You will find thousands. Look at all American newspapers from that era. And I bet you will find more than 100,000 references to people being bought and sold like livestock. In only 3 lines, that advertisement in the Tribune illuminates a world of pain. What does it have to do with Jewell? Sure, the beginning of the story of Jewell Hall is on the same page as an advertisement for selling a woman and child. But do we have any evidence that the sale has anything to do with the college? It is true that we cannot prove a connection between the sale of this enslaved woman and child and the college. But what about others? Did Jewell's founders sell human beings? These men gave generously to create the college. And if they made money selling human beings, it means that in some part, even if limited, the college benefited from slave trading. Before we get into that, you need to know more about the big picture information the students, alumni, and I have gathered about slavery and the founders of Jewell. There were 33 founding trustees of William Jewell College in 1849 and 1850. These were men of influence, prestige, and usually considerable wealth and power. They came from Clay County in the west, all the way to St. Louis in the east. 9 of the 33 founders were from Clay County, by far the most of any county. Among those 33, how many owned people? 31 out of 33. 94% of Jewell's founders owned enslaved people. Of the 23 trustees who joined the board from 1851 to 1865, 19 were slave owners. Of the 56 founders and trustees of William Jewell College, 50 were slave owners, 89%. If you try to explain that away by saying that's just the way things were, many people in Missouri owned slaves, no, 3% of white Missourians in 1850 were slave owners. To be sure, a better measure of directly benefiting from slavery would be how many people lived in slaveholding households. But even with that more expansive measure, only 1 in 8 white Missouri families owned slaves. But again, looking bigger picture, in addition to that, many people rented slaves. They benefited from slavery in that way, and they aspired to join the slaveholding class. And the large majority of white Missourians supported slavery. But my point is that the extent to which almost all of Jewell's founders and early trustees personally benefited from slavery, and in many cases were strongly invested in maintaining the institution, was much greater than white Missourians as a whole. And we know that a very significant amount of wealth used by Jewell's founders to establish and support the college came from owning and exploiting enslaved people. We then wanted to know how many enslaved people were being exploited by the founders to provide a significant amount of the college's financial foundation. After a great deal of research, we found that in the decades leading up to the Civil War, the founders, early trustees, and major financial backers of William Jewell College owned and acquired wealth from the enslavement and exploitation of more than 700 African-American men, women, and children. The founders made money in other ways, including as doctors, lawyers, bankers, merchants, and investing in land. But many of the wealthiest founders and the most generous donors were large-scale farmers who owned a dozen or more enslaved people and acquired most of their wealth by forcing those enslaved people to perform backbreaking agricultural labor. William Jewell College was built on the backs of enslaved people. Now, you might ask, why pick on Jewell? Can't you say the same about every other Southern college before the Civil War? Exactly. What does that tell you about the history of American higher education and American society as a whole? Does learning about the pro-slavery past of Jewell make you think any differently about American history? And on one point, you would be wrong. In Missouri, there were colleges who had some founders and faculty who were strongly anti-slavery. Check out Marian College and Washington University. Jewell's founders had a moral choice available to them on the question of slavery. The vast majority chose to support the institution, the main exception being Dr. William Jewell, who clearly had anti-slavery sentiments. But even his record in that regard has been exaggerated in college histories, as the research of Jewell student Kristen Santiago has shown. But you might wonder, isn't it possible that Jewell's founders, especially white Clay Countians, were kind masters who owned enslaved people, but treated them well and were reluctant to buy and sell them? That brings us back to the sale of enslaved people and the financial origins of Jewell. Abijah Withers was an important Clay Countian founder of the college. He owned 9 people in 1850 and 20 in 1860. Robert Steele Withers, Abijah's grandson, studied at Jewell in the 1890s. In 1949, at a banquet celebrating Jewell's centennial, Robert Steele Withers recounted a story about how buying and selling enslaved people contributed directly to the college's endowment. The newspaper story A story that illustrated how anxious were the citizens to support the college movement was told. It was of Grandfather Abijah who approached a neighbor named Sheely. The man had little money to give, but responded with, "I am interested in this movement, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I have a Negro slave girl, and I'll just donate the girl." Essentially, Abijah Withers told Sheely, "Give me ownership of the girl, and I will take her price that I would normally pay to you, and instead give that money directly to William Jewell College." Robert Withers continued, "The offer was accepted, the purchase price went to the college endowment, so it happened in the very beginning that the price of this Negro girl was incorporated in the college finances." The college endowment in the 1850s was around $60,000. Jewell Hall cost $31,000 to build. Let's say Withers paid $600, an average price of the time, to Sheely to purchase the enslaved girl. Withers then gave that money to Jewell. And that is far from the only example of profits from selling enslaved people being added to the college endowment. Another story. James T.V. Thompson was a very important founder of the college. He donated the land for campus. He was also Clay County's largest slave owner, owning 39 people in 1850. Most of the enslaved people he owned were forced to labor in farming, but he also made money slave trading. We have evidence of that from the 1840s, buying and selling people, and Jewell student Jamie Kuhn found this in an issue of the Tribune. Two valuable Negro men, one of them 28 or 30, and the other about 21, will be offered for sale. Contact Judge Thompson for details. Thompson bought land with capital he gained in part through exploiting, including selling human beings. He then gave some of that land to William Jewell College. Some portion, even if small, of the land that Thompson gave to the college was purchased with profits from slave trading. Another story. Although Clay County resident Michael Arthur was not a trustee, he was a generous donor to the college. He was a wealthy businessman who made money in many ways, including as a merchant and a banker. He also acquired wealth from being Clay County's premier slave trader. In the Tribune from Arthur, "I will expose at public sale to the highest bidder two valuable Negroes, one a woman about 15 years of age, the other about 11 years of age, both sound and of good character and slaves for life." We actually have a picture of a slave pen Arthur used to imprison enslaved people before selling them. Arthur made money buying and selling human beings. Arthur gave money to the college. Now, in the sale I'm mentioning here, Arthur was a slave trader, but the young women were owned by another Jewell trustee and Clay County resident, Dr. William Morton. Morton profited from that sale. He gave money to the college, some portion of which came from selling a 15-year-old and an 11-year-old girl. Other Jewell trustees and Clay Countians, including Liberty Mayor Madison Miller and wealthy businessman E.M. Samuel, are also on record selling people. Those men gave money to the college. Some percentage of their money, which went into the college endowment, came from selling people. If you respond with, "You're exaggerating how much of the college's endowment came from slavery," look at the $10,000 worth of land that Dr. William Jewell gave to the college. That is land, not slavery-produced wealth. Where did Dr. Jewell get the money to purchase that land? From his medical practice, from investing in land, and from owning and benefiting from the labor of enslaved people, including 13 in 1830 and 6 in 1840. Dr. William Jewell was a savvy businessman. There's no doubt that he used some of the wealth that he gained from exploiting enslaved people to invest in land. Other trustees did the same. Those men would have had far less money to give to Jewell if they had not been able to invest slavery-produced capital in other ways. The college shut down for 2 years in the 1850s for lack of money. Every dollar counted. Many of those came from the coerced labor of enslaved people. Without the labor of enslaved people, William Jewell College would not exist. There are other ways to see slavery's influence on Jewell's history. Consider Jewell Hall. We should celebrate the learning that has happened there and the human flourishing that Jewell Hall has helped enable. It is a place where incredibly positive things have happened for generations. That history should be known. Jewell Hall is a physical embodiment of our community's highest ideals. But look at the history of Jewell Hall from another angle. We know that the money to build Jewell Hall came in significant part from the labor of enslaved people, that enslaved people in Lexington made the bricks for Jewell Hall and brought them from Liberty Landing to the Hill, that contractors who built Jewell Hall enslaved many people, and recently, Jewell alumna, SMJP member, and historian Michelle Cook, one of the most impressive researchers I have ever had the privilege to work with, found conclusive evidence that enslaved people participated in building Jewell Hall. Jewell Hall is a monument to education. Jewell Hall is also a monument to the labor of enslaved people. Other points. Jewell's first 3 presidents were slave owners, as were several of the faculty. Leaders model moral behavior for their students. What did the students see? What were the students taught regarding slavery? In 1860, an observer described the curriculum at Jewell. This is a Missouri institution, and in it, nothing is taught which will sway the minds of students to lay their hands upon the institutions of the state, a reference to slavery. What about Jewell, slavery, and the Civil War? We know that many Jewell students, alumni, faculty, trustees fought for the Confederacy. Jewell student Haley Michael is working on an exact count. But in conversations about slavery in Jewell, some people point to Jewell trustees who favored the Union, men like Alexander Donovan, but leave out that they were strongly pro-slavery and deep into the war still hoped that slavery as an institution could be saved. In 1861, Donovan advocated for constitutional amendments which would have effectively guaranteed the perpetual survival of American slavery by forbidding Congress from ever abolishing it. In 1863, he backed a plan of gradual emancipation that would have kept some enslaved people in Missouri in bondage until the early 1900s. Next year, Jewell student Tavares Pennington and Jewell alumna Michelle Cook will have more to say about Donovan. I want to note that there were strongly anti-slavery members of the Jewell community. If we define that community to include the many enslaved people who were exploited by the college's founders and early trustees in order to provide the financial foundation for the college. Among those enslaved people were many who resisted the brutality of slavery by striving to hold their families together against the daily onslaught of a slaveholding society, in becoming literate when it was illegal to teach Black people in Missouri to read, by carving out some degree of autonomy to worship God in the way that they saw fit, by seeking freedom and trying to escape enslavement. I can tell you stories about several people who had been enslaved by Jewell founders but managed to escape, including one who went on to become an important Baptist minister in Minnesota, and another who escaped all the way to Canada and became an internationally known abolitionist. Other enslaved people held by the Jewell community resisted by doing things like burning down Lightburn's rope factory, by killing a slave owner who had beaten a loved one, and by winning their freedom in a court of law. And we must remember the most overt and powerful resistance. Many of the men enslaved by the Jewell community, when given the opportunity to fight for the Union and for their freedom, the freedom of their families, and for all enslaved people, chose to enlist in the U.S. colored troops regiments and contributed to defeating a rebellion that had been launched to defend slavery. That resistance, that anti-slavery action from these most forgotten members of the Jewell community, that is a history that we should know. Maybe you're thinking, it's an interesting story, but that was a long time ago. Why bring up these painful things? Why not focus on positive things that make people proud of their community? There are more good reasons to study slavery than I can easily count, but I am well over time. I'll conclude by returning to the ideas that are motivating my students and me to carry out our work. In 1964, Fannie Lou Hamer said, when you take a very close look at this American society, it's time to question things. It's still time. It should always be time to question things about our communities and our country. If we are unwilling to look at the past with clear eyes and a genuine desire for understanding, rather than only paying attention to uplifting narratives that make us proud, how can we improve? Faulkner wrote, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Some people would prefer that the past I brought up should be buried and forgotten. I think that is the wrong approach. I know my students think that is the wrong approach. We often mention in class a line from James Baldwin. I love America more than any country in the world, and for exactly this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. Constructive criticism is a requirement for improvement. And if we tell an exclusionary history of our community and our country that mentions slavery but moves on quickly to more positive things, what does that say about our commitment to talking honestly about the present and doing the hard work to promote inclusion in the future? But if we tell an inclusive, uncompromising history about our community's pro-slavery past, I think that sends a positive message that we are people who are dedicated to reckoning with the past in order to better understand the present so that we can build a more inclusive future for our community. One final note before I go, please go read James Baldwin's Talk to Teachers from 1963. It is electric, and it provided an intellectual foundation for much of the work that you heard about tonight. Thank you again to Clay Countians for Inclusion for the opportunity to present. I hope that at least some of the people watching will find value in what you've heard tonight. Thank you.